Okay, so we've just talked about this really important concept in CSS called layout, and it's how you can make different elements on the page sort of interact in different ways. Now I want to walk through a few sort of different disparate concepts. They're a little bit smaller. And this first one, I want to focus on these buttons that we've just made. And one thing that bothers me with them is that when my mouse hovers over them, they don't change. When I click on them, nothing happens except, of course, what they're supposed to do and open a new, a different page. But what I want them to do is respond like I'm pressing a real button, you know, change color and maybe even get a little bit smaller. And that's not happening. Fortunately, CSS has a solution for this. There are these things called pseudoclasses in CSS. And they're kind of like classes, but not really, hence the name. And what they do is they let you select things based on a state that an element is in. So for example, is an element currently being hovered over by the mouse? Or is it currently being clicked by the mouse? And a whole bunch of other things, but those are the two we'll focus on. So that means we can change how things look like, you know, depending on these properties. So what I can do is I can add some new selectors around this button. So I'm actually going to combine two kinds of selectors. One is the class selector, so I'm saying for all buttons, and then I'm going to use this colon to create a pseudo class selector. And then I can say hover. So what this is saying is for all buttons that are hovered over, do this. And what I want to do is change the color of the background. And we'll see this thing. I actually want the button to get lighter when I hover over it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to quickly run into coolers. I've got my nice blue here. And what I want to do is just make that a teensy bit lighter. Maybe like that. Yeah, that looks good. And I'll copy that. And so I want to make the background different color like that. And now if I refresh the page, when I hover over the buttons, they change color. That's great. The other thing I want to do is I want to make them change when I click them, when I hold down a click, like a button, button changes when you actually press it. And this is done with the active pseudo class. So when a button is active, do this thing. Now, just like I did with this color, I also want a slightly darker version of this color. So I want to make you maybe do a little bit of that. Yeah, I'm happy with that color. And I'm going to say background, change it like that. And so now when I hover over it, it becomes lighter. When I click down, it becomes darker. Great. But I want to add a little bit more realism. And I want the button to actually get smaller when I click down on it. There's this neat property called transform, and you can do a whole bunch of things with it. But for the time being, I just want to scale. So I'm going to say scale 0.9. What I'm saying is make this element a little bit smaller, make it 0.9 times the size it was when it's active. So now if I refresh, it gets a little bit smaller. That's pretty neat. So, and when I click the button, it actually does what it's supposed to do. But there's one thing that's still bugging me about this. It's still really jolty. So, these things snap instantaneously. What I want is, a smooth transition from this color to this light one, from this one to this dark one getting smaller. I don't like the way it's so snappy. So how do I slow it down a little bit? With one CSS property. It's called transition. Does what it says on the tin. And now it's saying every time something changes, do it over a time period instead of instantly. In this case, I put in 0.2s, meaning seconds. So a fifth of a second. So every time I change something, it'll actually do it over a fifth of a second instead of instantly. So now when I refresh the page, what we'll see is a smooth change. Oh, yes. That is good. So no more snappy, jolty changes. I've got these smooth transitions. So now these buttons are at a state I'm pretty happy with them. So we can move on, but I quite like where we've gone with those. So the next thing I want to talk about is this image up here. This is a disaster. I wanna make it a little bit better. So from the beginning of this, I wanted to turn this into what we call a hero. This big, bold section at the start of a website with maybe an image background, some big text, introducing you to the website. Now this particular bit is going to be more of a demonstration of what you can do with CSS rather than a tutorial. Feel free to copy this as well, but I'm just going to show you a few tricks that you can use to turn this thing into a hero. So firstly, what I'm going to do is I am going to create a new div, and I'm going to call it hero container. So I'm going to make two elements, two new classes. One is going to be the container for the hero, and one is going to be the text inside it. And inside here, I'm going to put this h1, and I'm going to call this hero text. And notice that I've moved this outside of the main content because I want this to be the full width of the page. And I'm going to delete this image for now. So I've made I've made these two elements. I've given them two different classes, hero container and hero text. Nothing much has changed, except this is now up to the top left here. So first things first, let's tackle this hero container. So here we go. Here's what I'm going to do. I want to make it have a lot of padding. Particularly, on the left, we can have sort of 20 pixels, and on the right, we can have 20 pixels, but on the top and bottom, I want a lot, 150 pixels, 150 pixels. And as well as that, I want to make its background an image, not just a color. And you can actually do that. By wrapping a file name in this URL, I can point towards an image instead of just giving it a color. So I'm referring to that desk.jpg file again. As well as that, I want the background size to be cover. This basically means make the image big enough to fit the entire container of the hero, and I also want to center it. So I'm going to set it background position to center. That's what those things do. And finally, I want to center the text. So it sits in the middle. Now if I refresh, okay, we're getting somewhere. So this is starting to look a lot closer to what I wanted. Some things I notice I want to change immediately. There's this frustrating border around the top of the hero here. Now that's because browsers by default put a bunch of padding in the document, but we know better. We don't want it. So I'm going to say body HTML. This is a little declaration that usually gets rid of all that space on different browsers because they all do it in slightly different ways. So now if I refresh the page, it's gone. Also, I want this container here to be pushed down just a little bit because it's butting right up against the hero, and I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is add just a little bit of margin, let's say 20 pixels. Okay, now it's staying away. It's looking pretty good, pretty close to what I wanted. But I also want to change some things. I don't want this text to be bright green. I want it to be maybe all caps, spaced a little bit, and probably closer to a darker blue. Yeah, this one that we use for the text, I reckon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add something for the hero text. So firstly, I'm going to set its color to that one we just made. Sorry, to the color of our dark blue text. And then I want to use this text transform to make it all uppercase. And then finally, I want to use this letter spacing to add a little bit of spacing between each of the letters as it describes, because uppercase can be a little bit jarring. And if I refresh the page, there we go. That is much closer to what I want. Finally, these elements have a little bit of intrinsic margin to them, and I just want to get rid of it because it might be messing with what's in the center of the page. So let's just shrunk it down a little bit, but hopefully it should be a little bit closer to center now. Okay, so I know that was a bit of an information onslaught, but this is the hero. Finally managed to make it, and that's really cool. So we've just made the hero. Something else I want to explain to you is making your websites behave well on mobile. There are a whole bunch of different strategies you can use to do this, but it's very important to consider it because a lot of people who use websites use them on their phones. So I can quickly take a look at what my website looks on mobile. You can do it in a bunch of ways. You can do it by shrinking the screen. I'm going to use this little mobile inspector tool, which lets me take a look at what a website looks like. I want to say maybe what it looks like on an iPhone. And what I notice immediately is it all looks really small and hard to read. Now, that can be fixed. So there's this snippet of code that we just need to copy and paste, really. I don't even know it myself, so I'm going to copy and paste it from here. It's this thing. It's a meta tag, and it goes in the head of your website, and it basically tells the browser, I'm going to be a mobile-friendly website. Let me do what I want. So let's relinquish some control and put that in. So now I can refresh the page, and it doesn't look much better. So let's keep working to improve this. But that was necessary, believe me. Okay, so there are some things that are making this page bigger than it needs to be. We want it to scale down to fit the entirety of the width of the phone that we're putting it on. And there are some things that are bucking against that. One is this video right here, and the other one is this content container we made earlier. Remember, we said it was 600 pixels wide. That is wider than the width of the iPhone 7, which is 375 pixels wide. So it's doing funny things. So what we need to do is make both of these elements scale to fit the size of their container. Let's tackle that. Let's tackle that main content thing first. This is fairly easy. So what we can do is set max width to 100%. Now what we're saying is this thing should be 600 pixels wide unless it's bigger than its container, in which case, cap it there. So we're seeing the maximum width that it can have. Refresh the page. Things are much better because this video is still annoying us. So there's this website called Embed Responsively. And it gives us video embed codes that are a little more sensible, that act a little bit nicer. The thing that YouTube gave us didn't work as well as we wanted it to. So if I open that on YouTube, I can grab that video code, chuck it in here, and click embed. And what it gives me is a snippet of code. I'm not going to go into the details of how this works. If you know a lot about HTML and CSS, you can actually create this yourself fairly straightforwardly, but it's very easy just to take the embed code from this website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this and replace this iframe from YouTube and replace it with this large piece of embed code. And then when I refresh the page, put it in mobile. Okay, things are looking a lot better now. It actually looks adequately sized. One final problem is we're noticing that this goes right up to the edge of its container. We want the text to be a little bit further away from the screen, the edges of the screen. So what I can do finally is add a little bit of padding. So I'm going to say I want it to be at around 20 pixels of padding, and that should be it. Unfortunately, what I've just introduced is a scroll bar. Nothing's easy, right? So unfortunately, what's happening here is we're setting the width to 100% plus 20 pixels, which is on either side, which is slightly larger than 100%. That's just the way the box model works. And we can change that behavior in a funny way. Don't worry too much about this, but it's just a little bit of a trick to fix a quirk with how sizing works. And what we're saying here is include this 20 pixels of padding within our width. If you're, you can read up on this if you're more interested about it, but that's sort of the fast way of explaining it. Now when I refresh the page, it looks like it's working as it should. There's no sideways scrolling. I can scroll up and down, everything's readable. And if I actually opened this up on my phone, I would see something similar to this. So that is a pretty good step. So now I'm gonna close this and we can return to this. Okay, so we've just gone over a myriad of different little bits and pieces around CSS, and so it's worth exploring those. So here's a bit of a task. So firstly, try and make those buttons a little more active and reactive to user input by using these pseudoclasses. Use the transition property to make them change smoothly as opposed to instantly. It's a bit of a challenge. Can you figure out how to make those properties change at different speeds? For example, can you figure out how to make the size change slower than the color? Then try making your website responsive so that it works well on mobile websites. And what I mean by responsive is just the general term for websites that work well on different screens. Finally, there's a tool in CSS called media queries, and as a bit of a challenge, can figure out what they do and how to use them. That is all I have to say about some of the things I wanted to impart onto you about CSS. There are some other things that are worth looking at, and I just want to quickly go through some further reading if you're interested in exploring things. Firstly, there's this thing called the CSS Almanac. By the way, these are linked all on the notes as some further reading. This has a list of every CSS property and every kind of CSS selector, and it's very, very thorough. As you can see, there aren't actually that many things to go through. You could feasibly explore them all, but they're all they all have their own intricacies and all let you do interesting things. Also, if you're interested in learning about selectors, CSS selectors, you can use this thing called a CSS Diner, which is an interesting little game where it teaches you CSS selectors with food and plates. So for example, it says right here, select the plates. It's got a little bit of an explanation, and I want to say, all right, I'll select the plates. And it goes on like that, and it explains very, very complicated ways of doing CSS. So that's quite interesting. If you're more interested in layout and making really complicated ways of interacting with different elements on the page, there's this really interesting technology in CSS called Flexbox, and it's quite comprehensive and it's got a lot of quirks. It's a workshop in and of itself, but I recommend reading up on that if you want to create really complicated website layouts. And finally, if you don't care that much at all for web design and you just want a sort of drop-in piece of code that can make your websites look pretty for you, and you can just worry about making websites, there's this thing called Bootstrap, which is an extremely popular framework. Mainly in the CSS realm. You basically drop in a CSS file and you just add classes to your HTML to make them look nice. And you don't have to do any more than that. It's incredibly well documented and incredibly easy to use. If you're not interested in using CSS. And finally, if you're ever interested in how a website works, you're like, gee, I like the look of this. I'm interested to know what CSS they've applied to get this particular look. Most browsers come with this tool called Inspect. And you can right-click on an element and it'll tell you exactly what's going on. So I can click on this headline and I can see all the styles that are applied to it and exactly how it's achieved what it's made and all the elements and how they're structured, and it's really, really useful. So for Chrome, it's as easy as right-click Inspect. In different browsers, I think it's slightly different. So just search on how to open up the element inspector on your particular browser. We've covered everything we wanted to say about CSS, from basic things about how to use the syntax and changing the look and feel of elements to more complex things like laying out elements on the page and responding to user input and behaving well on mobile. And next we'll be going on to JavaScript, which is a technology to make your website a little more interactive. When you click on that button, rather than going to a website, what if it could do something completely different? And that's what we'll be going over